Welcome to the Wealth Wisdom, where knowledge becomes power and power builds your future.
You've probably been told the world works on hard work, innovation, and fair competition. That rich nations became rich because they played the game smarter, not because the game itself was built for them. But what if that entire idea has been a master illusion? What if the prosperity of today, as wealthiest nations, isn't simply the result of brilliance, but the result of a quietly engineered system designed to lock in their economic dominance? For generations, a system so deeply embedded in global trade, finance, and diplomacy that most people never notice it. Yet it shapes the price of your food, your currency's value, your country's debts, and even the future of your children. And here's the strangest part. This system didn't begin with modern governments. It didn't start with the World Bank or the IMF. Its roots go back centuries, buried in colonial trade networks, rewritten history books, and economic doctrines polished to look like universal truth. But behind the polished surface lies a hidden architecture, and once you see how it works, you can't unsee it. Today's story is not about secret organizations meeting in dark rooms. It's about something far more powerful: incentives, institutions, and rules of the global economy that quietly tilt the playing field, always in the same direction. These rules don't need conspiracies. They just need momentum. And once set in motion, they continue running automatically, generation after generation. To understand the secret plan that keeps rich countries rich, we need to rewind time to a moment when global wealth wasn't so uneven, when nations were still figuring out how to compete, and when the choices of a few empires created the blueprint that the world still follows today. But before we go there, let me ask you a question. Why is it that every decade dozens of developing countries announce reforms, policies, and anti-poverty programs, yet the global gap between rich and poor nations barely moves? Why do some countries remain stuck exporting raw materials while others control the industries that turn those materials into trillion-dollar markets? Why do financial crises in poorer nations almost always end with the same institutions stepping in, offering the same solutions, with the same outcomes? That pattern is not an accident, and to uncover its origins, we need to begin with an empire that mastered economic strategy long before the world even had a name for it. In the 1500s and 1600s, European empires were entering a new age. Ships crossed oceans with cargo that could change a nation's destiny. But something interesting happened during this period. The wealthiest countries weren't the ones with the most resources. They were the ones who controlled the rules of trade and the value chain. Take Britain. It wasn't the richest in gold or spices or land, but it perfected a strategy that would later be imitated by nearly every powerful nation. Don't just trade control the conditions of trade. Instead of letting colonies build their own industries, Britain pushed policies that forced them to export raw materials and import finished goods. Cotton was grown in India, shipped to British factories, and sold back as clothing at many times the price. Sugar, timber, tobacco each followed the same pattern. Raw products left the colonies. Wealth stayed in the empire, But here is the twist most people don't know. These early trade rules didn't end with colonialism. After World War II, as former colonies gained independence, the economic blueprint didn't disappear. It evolved. It modernized. It was reborn inside new institutions that claimed to promote global prosperity, but often reinforced the same old hierarchy. To understand how that happened, we need to jump to 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference. Imagine a room filled with economists, political leaders, and financial architects in the chaos after the war. The global economy was shattered. Nations needed stability. And so the conference created the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and eventually laid the foundation for global trade rules that still govern the world today. On paper, these institutions promised fairness, but built into their design was a structural advantage for the countries that had the most capital, the strongest currencies, and the most influence during the negotiations. And those countries were, unsurprisingly, the same ones that had dominated world trade for centuries. This is where the secret plan begins, not in a dark conspiracy, but in the way global systems were structured from the start. Because once a country has more power in the voting structure of institutions like the IMF or World Bank, it naturally guides policy toward outcomes that protect its own stability and industries. If that sounds abstract, let's break it down. Imagine two countries, one wealthy, one not. Both want to industrialize. Both want to build factories, invest in technology, and grow their economies. But the wealthy nation already has strong banks, reliable infrastructure, and a currency trusted around the world. It can borrow money at extremely low interest rates. It can invest in new industries without worrying about capital flight. And because its currency is seen as safe, it can even finance other countries' debt and earn profit in the process. Meanwhile, the poorer nation faces high borrowing costs, currency instability, and the constant risk that investors will leave at the first sign of political tension. So when it tries to build a new industry, say electronics manufacturing or steel production, it faces a problem. Its loans are more expensive, its equipment costs more, and its products struggle to compete against industries in wealthier countries that have been protected and subsidized for decades. This is what economists call path dependency, where the starting point determines the outcome, no matter how hard the latecomer tries. But here's where the plot thickens. The wealthiest nations didn't just rely on their head start. They perfected a modern version of the colonial trade pattern, encouraged developing countries to stay focused on raw materials and simple manufacturing, while keeping high-tech, high-profit industries at home. How? Through 5 powerful mechanisms. Trade agreements that lower tariffs on products the rich nations export, while keeping critical sectors protected. Intellectual property rules that make advanced technology expensive or restricted. Loan conditions from international institutions that limit how developing countries can support their industries. Currency structures that keep developing nations vulnerable to exchange rate swings. Global supply chains in which wealthy countries control design, branding, and high-value components, while poorer countries do the low-paid assembly work. Let's take an example you see every day: the smartphone. A phone assembled in Vietnam or India might be labeled made in country, but most of its profit doesn't stay there. The design, patents, software, marketing, and high-value components come from the US, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, countries that control the intellectual property. The assembly factories earn a tiny fraction of the final profit. This pattern repeats across the entire global economy: clothes, cars, pharmaceuticals, electronics, even agriculture. But this raises a deeper question. Why don't developing nations simply rise up the value chain? Why don't they invest in higher-level manufacturing, branding, or R&D? The answer lies in one of the most misunderstood turning points in economic history: the debt crises of the 1980s. During the 1970s, many developing countries borrowed heavily to industrialize. The loans were encouraged by global banks swimming in oil money. At first, it worked. Factories grew, economies expanded. Then interest rates in the US skyrocketed. Suddenly, countries that were paying 5% interest were now paying 15 to 20%. Their debt exploded. Inflation surged. Investors pulled out. And dozens of countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia plunged into crisis. This is where the secret plan solidified, because the rescue packages came with strict conditions. Countries were told, stop supporting your local industries, remove tariffs protecting your factories, privatize state-owned companies, open your markets to foreign competitors, focus on exporting raw materials to earn foreign currency. In theory, these policies were supposed to fix economic inefficiencies. In practice, they often had devastating effects. Factories closed. Local industries collapsed under competition from decades-old giants in rich countries. And nations that once tried to industrialize were pushed back into exporting low-value goods. Meanwhile, wealthy nations continued subsidizing their own farmers, protecting their own tech sectors, and investing billions into R&D advantages that poorer nations were told they weren't allowed to copy. Cause and effect, rule and outcome, pattern and repetition. This is the architecture that has quietly kept rich countries rich. But to understand how effective this system is, let's fast forward to today. You might think globalization has made the world more equal. After all, trade is open, technology is everywhere, markets are interconnected. But the numbers tell a different story. Today, 10 countries control more than 80% of global technology patents. The top 1% of nations control more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. Developing nations pay over $200 billion a year in interest alone. Money that leaves their economies and flows back to banks in wealthy nations. And here's the most shocking fact of all. For every dollar one of a developing country receives, it loses $3 to $4 in debt payments, profit repatriation, and trade imbalances. This means money flows from poorer nations to rich ones every year, silently, consistently. But the world rarely talks about this. Instead, we're told that some countries are naturally successful and others are naturally poor. That some societies are more hardworking or more efficient. That the gap is cultural, not structural. But when you look at the historical record, the data, the institutional design, and the cause and effect sequences, another conclusion emerges. The global economic system was built during an era of inequality, designed by countries that already held power, optimized to preserve their advantage, and then locked in through institutions, agreements, and financial rules that are incredibly difficult to change. Not because of a secret conspiracy, but because when systems benefit those who design them, they tend to remain in place. The story gets even more interesting when we look at modern parallels. Why did so many countries struggle to develop their own pharmaceutical industries during global health crises? Because intellectual property rules created decades ago still dominate today. Why do currencies in developing countries collapse faster during global shocks? Because their financial systems depend on foreign capital that can leave at any moment. Why can't developing nations simply print money like the US or Europe during emergencies? Because their currencies aren't reserve currencies. When they print money, investors flee. Why do rich nations insist on free trade for others, but maintain protection for themselves? Because they understand something most developing nations were pressured to forget. Every rich country today became rich through decades of protectionism, subsidies, and industrial strategy. Not one major industrial power grew through free market purity, not the US. Not Britain, not France, not Germany, not Japan, not South Korea. Yet developing countries are told to play by different rules. This is the hidden contradiction at the heart of the global economy. And that brings us to the present age where old systems are showing cracks. Some developing nations are breaking the pattern through strategic investment, domestic manufacturing, and technology development. Countries like China, Vietnam, India, Malaysia, and others are challenging the old hierarchy. But the road is still incredibly steep, because the institutions, agreements, and financial structures of the past remain deeply embedded in today's world. So what does all this mean for you? Sitting here watching this video, it means the world you live in is shaped by decisions made decades before you were born, decisions that created wealth for some nations and obstacles for others. It means the products you buy, the jobs available in your country, and the value of your currency are influenced by forces far beyond local politics. And most importantly, it means history didn't end. The system is still evolving. The same patterns repeat. The same structures persist. But cracks are appearing. And the future will belong to the nations that understand the game and learn how to rewrite it. Before we close, let's leave you with 3 takeaways. First, global inequality is not natural, it's engineered. Not by villains in shadows, but by systems created in an era of power and preserved through incentives. Second, nations rise not by obeying the rules of others, but by strategically breaking them, just like every current rich nation did in its early development. Third, the future is not set. The world is shifting. Technology is decentralizing. Manufacturing is moving. Populations are changing. And countries that understand economic strategy, not just economics, will shape the next century. So the real question is, will your nation accept the world as it was designed, or help redesign the world to come? If you found this exploration eye-opening, share it, discuss it, question it, And if you want more deep investigations into global systems, history, and the forces shaping your life, consider subscribing. Your curiosity is the first step toward understanding the hidden architecture of the world. Because once you see how the system works, you're no longer just playing the game. You're learning how to change it.